All right. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining tonight. I am joined by Nick. Nick, how do you pronounce your surname? I'm not going to give it a try.
Spyratos.
Okay, that was surprisingly easy.
Yeah,
I could have probably given
literal. Yeah, I've
Okay,
got my fair
cool.
share of Spyratos.
There you go. So yeah, like I also don't know what's going on with my video cam. Like everything seems super washed. Like it's high contrast, but it is what it is. All right. So I see there's a couple of familiar faces in the comments. You guys know the drill. I don't want to waste too much time because I'm super keen to get this started. But if you have any comments, any questions as we go, please leave them in the text chat. And we'll maybe stop every now and then and actually kind of like address some questions that people might have. If you don't know what FEDSA is, or this is the first time you're tuning into one of our streams, so we are Frontend Development South Africa. And basically, we try and do one of these each month. And initially, so the idea I had was I wanted Nick to do a bit of a talk on something like Tailwind or so forth, because I know he'll probably talk about that a bit. Kind of he's very into what you would call the tall stack. And I think then like we actually decided like let's maybe just do like an actual Laravel talk. It's been since forever since I've touched PHP. My journey is probably very similar to a lot of people in where I'm finding myself. I know it's for Xandor, who's also very involved with the front-end development South Africa thing as well. He also started out as a WordPress, Joomla, kind of Drupal, that kind of era. And same here, did a bit of PHP back then. And then from there, I kind of transitioned more into kind of the client-side stuff. But apparently, PHP isn't the same. Like I'm very cautious now in terms of. But let me put it this way: like I did not enjoy PHP, and my guess is Nick is probably going to convince me that it's very different now. It's not the same beast. And I'm open. My heart is open. I'm open to love. We'll see. John Rue, who's in the comments, has also been trying to convert me to PHP is actually good now. But yeah, let's get this started before I kind of dig myself even further into a hole. Nick, do you want to give a bit of an overview of like who you are and kind of what you do day in, day out, and kind of what your relation is to Laravel and PHP?
Alrighty, I do have a slide for that exact thing, so let me put that up.
Funny you would ask.
Yeah. Okay, it is still open. Let's do that. Alrighty, so we'll skip straight ahead. Who's Nick? With my little plugs there, we've got to start that. Always got to get that going. So, hey everyone, I'm Nick. Just like our AA intros we do. I've been a Laravel developer for most of my career. I've done a little bit of other stuff. I've done a little bit of front end. Early on, I wrote a bit of Perl. I wrote C#. I learned Java in college. And I too didn't actually like PHP while I was studying. I tried it out for some stuff because I was like, in second year, a few classmates of mine, we were like, yeah, we're going to start a startup. We're going to make $1 million. And we downloaded some like classifieds template based in PHP. And we were like, cool, we're going to make a new Gumtree. That lasted about 5 minutes. So yeah, not a great time. But moving on, I'm very passionate about this Laravel sort of thing. I've had my own fair share of hosting meetups, previously with PHP Cape Town, which later became PHP South Africa. And as of this year, I've morphed it all into Laravel Cape Town, going back to a bit more in-person type of thing.
I have a ton of questions around that. I don't want to derail us right now. But Matt, I'm going to dig into that definitely at some point in terms of why the narrowing of focus from PHP to Laravel.
Yeah. No, definitely keen to touch on that. Maybe write down the questions for the end, maybe. Righty. Should we continue, or was there?
No, I think that's I think that's great. Like let's
Cool.
get started. Let's get into it.
Yeah. Righty. So first of all, why talk about Laravel? Why am I here to talk to everybody about backend stuff? Is this something valuable to you? I believe it is. And I have a few reasons for that I'm about to enumerate. First of all, PHP is cool again. Seriously. It had a bad rap for a long time, but nowadays it has a lot of the features you'd expect in a modern language, all the bells and whistles you'd want. And I think it's time for a bit of a refresher. Next up, fresh perspectives. I've been doing backend with maybe a tiny bit of Vue for most of my career, and I know many front-end developers may have had the opposite experience. So for me, it's always interesting to see and share this kind of perspective and see how devs in other niches are building all the cool stuff they build. Next up, backend insight. It's one thing to work with backend devs in your team if you work with any, and it's another to see what they can actually do with their tech. And we have a great metaphor for this. This is a picture of my backyard. Much like my backend code, it's nice, it's pleasant to be in, and I like it. For FEDSA members, this might be true for your front end, but my front end looks a bit more like my front yard. Functional, devoid of life, and with some random stuff that I didn't have space for. But after that, what I also would like to share is some new toys. I know there's kind of a JS framework of the week trend or meme at this point. And I'd like to share what toys we have around to play with. Fudge that up. Some toys to play with, yeah. Next up, for the more entrepreneurial among us, I believe Laravel is also an amazing starting point because it is very focused on user-end delivery and very rapid SaaS building. So yeah, keep that in mind. And lastly, just a bit of inspiration. Even between overlapping frameworks and languages like your Django's or your Rails in competition with Laravel, so to speak, they all take inspiration from each other. They all share some details. Why not do the same here? So the rough structure of this talk is as follows. We are currently at this next bit called PHP doesn't suck anymore. There are a bunch of sources for the things I'm going to talk about, but it's quite a lot to keep track of. So I'll mention some places to start at the end. But before I dive into Laravel specifically, like Skulk guessed very correctly, I want to talk about PHP itself and how it's improved and deserves a try these days. So first up, PHP doesn't suck anymore, nor is it dead. It never has been. There are things taking more of the market share that PHP used to have with WordPress and Drupal and all these things, with all the new low-code site editors and alternative CMS frameworks and all that fun stuff. But PHP still powers a good chunk of the web. South Africa specifically, I know, is also a sizable PHP developer market, surprisingly enough. So it's definitely worth talking about. Now, for those of you who have been around the block for a while, you may have read an article from 2012 titled PHP, a Fractal of Bad Design. For those of you who don't know it, it's an excellent piece and I believe a well-needed kick in the teeth for a language that was chugging along as a hodgepodge collection of bits, which is how PHP was originally developed anyway. It did truly suck back then. However, that was 2012. It's been 12 years since then, and the version back then was 5.3. We're on 8.3 now, 8.4, somewhere there. A lot has changed and much for the better. I'm not going to dive into everything on a super technical level here, as that would take up most of this talk, but I do want to mention some of the new goodies we have that are on par with other languages. For a more in-depth video on this topic, I would recommend the video where I drew this thumbnail from, titled PHP Doesn't Suck Anymore, by Aaron Francis. Very great video. Most of the section is actually lifted from it. So here's the things I'm going to talk about. There are 4 main categories of improvement as I see them: performance, class control, syntax sugar, and types. First up with performance. Notable things include opcache preloading, which is kind of like just loading your code and caching it, pretty much what it says on the box, to run it super fast after your first request or two. Then we have things like just-in-time compilation. And for those of you who had to host PHP sites back in the day, you might know of PHP FPM, which was kind of the program that your web server, your Nginx would talk to in order to run your actual PHP code. We have a few alternatives in that space now that can actually be a bit faster. The adoption of those is a bit slower, but I think it's still an exciting thing to look at. The rough numbers quoted have been something like a 4x increase in speed between PHP 5 and PHP 7, and another maybe 20% or so between 7 and 8. I've personally, like I said, I've been working on PHP for most of my career, so I've worked on sites with millions of users, hundreds of thousands of requests going through each day. Some were auto-scaled Kubernetes monstrosities, and they all just worked. Some were just 4 VPSs and a load balancer. So until you're doing really complex stuff, I think PHP can get you where you need to go. Next up, talking about the actual code. We have much better class control these days. So we've got things like traits, which you use more for composition instead of abusing inheritance in your OOP. We have enhanced classes with abstract, final, anonymous, read-only classes, a bunch of property stuff. We got attributes, which I believe are called annotations in other languages. And maybe most familiar to a lot of people will be enums. We finally have proper enums in PHP, which has been a blessing. I use them pretty much every day at this rate. So this is quite a full arsenal to take advantage of. Now, in terms of syntax sugar, again, a lot of different stuff. It all has its own names in each language, so it's hard to like kind of carry it across. But the big ones, I'll say, are arrow functions and a few array helpers, null coalescing operators, which make assignment and checking of null data a lot easier, and especially null chaining, which I believe in JavaScript is called optional chaining. That's very helpful as well. And then we have things like match statements instead of switch statements. Makes life a lot simpler. So we have weak maps and named arguments.
So just to check, some match, that's pattern matching?
Yeah, so instead of your switch statement, you have a match.
That's
again,
really
I'm not going into the syntax, but yeah. Like I said, check out that video I mentioned, and it'll have the examples there. So I'm not
gonna lie, that's really cool. Like there isn't pattern matching in JavaScript yet, so that's definitely one area. I'm a big fan of pattern matching. Like you can do it in TypeScript and so forth, but so that's definitely like a place where like PHP kind of is superior to JavaScript for me. JavaScript doesn't have pattern matching. Oh, that's really cool. Yeah.
I'll mention then, I guess the one big disadvantage so far is that PHP doesn't have generics. I don't know if it's a bit of drama on the so-called PHP Council, the foundation, not voting it in. It sounded like it was also a technical challenge with the language as it exists right now. So we still don't have generics. That's one big con. But we survive without it. We have our doc blocks to basically tell us what the generic would be, and we move on with life. Which I guess is a good segue to talk about types in general as well. This is the biggest one for me to talk about in this talk especially. I know this is a make or break for many developers who prefer strictly typed languages, whether they're scripted or interpreted or compiled or whatever you like. PHP has a lot of different kinds of typing. So type hints on your arguments, on your return types, your class properties can be typed. We have union types, so you can use multiple types for something. Intersection types, so if you want to type hint that something should be like 2 different interfaces instead of a specific class, you can do that. And yeah, there's a few more things that I won't go into. But yeah, strict enforcement is also one thing. There are some settings you can do, and automated code linting and quality tools can enforce this for you, such that your code will always run in strict mode. And thus, if you didn't put your types in properly and you're not doing your type juggling properly, it will error out and will show you very quickly where you're at. But on the other hand, this is also very flexible. Like PHP is very backwards compatible in this regard. I know some developers don't use this type stuff much at all. I mean, even Laravel took quite a while to adopt it. So yeah, I see that as an advantage. Use it to the degree you need or don't. And yeah, that's pretty much where I see PHP these days as having improved in great regards. And of course, moving on, we'll talk a bit about Laravel, but I want to say I'm not just mentioning all these things while I'm secretly still writing index.php with jQuery and like 1,000-line functions. I use the strict typing stuff myself. I use a good chunk of the new sugar and enums. And again, a lot of it is enforceable in an automated fashion these days. Like, I don't have to go look up the docs and like, what should this type be? How do I write this? What's my coding standard? I write a few commands and it's done for me. Whew, that was quite a bit. So let's get to Laravel itself. Talk more about the ecosystem and the community. We'll get to the front-end part, I promise. So what is Laravel? Laravel styles itself as the framework for web artisans. What this means is it's a batteries included, battle-tested, and powerful framework for all the buzzwords out there. And there are a lot of batteries included, as you can see here. So on this side, we have all the stock framework functions. On the top right here is just an indicator of some of the front-end integrations you can do. And this part is not meant to be legible. It's just an overview of all the official ecosystem parts that are not actually part of the core framework that you can add or use, or some of them are paid services. So there's a lot here that's not even touching the community side of it yet. Laravel empowers its developers by providing this vast array of utilities. And like I said before, it is also very much focused on end-user functionality. So you might notice some of this stuff overlaps to like software as a service providers. Like I'm going to talk a bit about these in a bit, but starter kits and authentication stuff, you don't need to worry about rolling your own auth, as it's not recommended usually. You can just install one of the auth scaffoldings for you, and it's done for you. So on a bit more of a technical note, Laravel follows the MVC pattern, Model View Controller. We get a new major release every year. Used to be a bit faster, but everyone felt that it was a bit too much. And we also get weekly releases of smaller new features. So there's always something new to try out at any given point with Laravel. Now, I've spoken quite a lot. This is quite a lot of stuff. There were like 50 different things in that picture. So let's break it down a bit. I'll go through most of the official ecosystem and some of the unofficial parts that I think are worth mentioning, some learning resources, some infrastructure, that sort of thing. So where do we start? Start with the starter kit, start with auth, and start with APIs. If some of you follow Indie Hacker Twitter recently, you'll see that SaaS boilerplates have become the current trend to sell. It's kind of like the new drop shipping of indie hacking, it seems. I mean, in the local ecosystem, we have the excellent SaaS Pegasus on the Django side, made by Korizhu. But on Laravel, we have two free options in Breeze and Jetstream. They both have standard authentication features like your registration, your login, your logout, profile management, and a basic UI scaffolding for all of these in various front-end stacks. So it's not just you pick a stack and stick to it if you want to use these. They offer multiple options. Jetstream in particular has more advanced features like API key management. If you use some of the API features, two-factor authentication, browser session management. And again, this is all available in multiple stacks. You can use it with Vue, you can use it with Livewire, which I'll talk about in a bit. And yeah, the options are endless. If that's all a bit much, or you'd like to use a different route, you can always go headless with Fortify, which just provides the logic and no UI. So you don't have to roll your own auth, even if you don't want to use these UIs. But auth and logins and APIs are more complex than just these things. So we have an accompanying suite of extra packages. Laravel Socialite will allow you to handle any OAuth social login with just about any platform, including custom ones by yourself. So your Google login, your Facebook login, GitHub, whatever, all out of the box right there. If you're doing some API work, for consuming APIs, Laravel has a built-in HTTP client. It's mostly a wrapper around Guzzle, for those who might know what that is, which simplifies API consumption. It's pretty much just HTTP, get your URL, shove any parameters you want there, easy peasy. On the API side, for actually building APIs and authenticating with them, Sanctum is a great option for probably most APIs. It has a very simple token authentication schema and extra functionality just to make API authentication for single-page applications much easier. But if you're building something a bit more complex and you want an OAuth 2 compliant API, Passport will do this for you. So, yeah, even just starting right out of the gate, we have these 6 items and probably more that I've forgotten even, just to get rolling with. But next, we need to manage our user data. So we have admin panels. I spoke to some people about this talk, and I'm like, are there admin panels in other tech ecosystems? It's not a well-defined scope of problem. So I would just give a short definition of an admin panel being any internal business tool panel intended for you to manage your software with. So if you built a custom panel to manage your e-commerce stock, for example, then you would probably do it in a tool like this. These are config-driven tools where you basically write what your UI should have in it and the logic that it actually processes, and the UI will be scaffolded for you. So basically halves your dev time specifically for your internal tools. That way you're not spending extra time building a UI just so your customer support agent can click an extra button or have a tooltip. So there are 2 main options in this space. 3, but the one has kind of gone away recently. Laravel Nova is the official solution here. It is a paid solution, so they make a bit of revenue of it. Like Django's admin panel, it simplifies the development of these internal panels, saves you this development effort, and has a nice UI. On the community side, there's something called Filament, which is an alternative, which I believe is a bit more flexible and is my tool of choice here. I've done quite a bit of work with Filament in the last few years. And it also goes even further because it's not just the admin panel side, but it provides all its UI components and logic available to use in your actual application. So it's not just stuck to this one narrow internal business function. Now, I'm not going to spend the rest of this talk just talking about more packages. I'm going to mention a lot of things in the ecosystem, but there's a lot more packages to talk about. So I'm about to give a highlights reel of a lot more things worth mentioning. On the payment side, you got to make payments if you've got to make money out of your app. Cashier provides a headless scaffold and data model for Stripe and paddle-driven payments. There are also community-made alternatives that are in the same interface style as Cashier. Lemon Squeezy made their own, and I've set myself the personal challenge in the next month to build one for Paystack's API. So keep an eye out for that one. If you want a fully fledged billing management solution like a Stripe Connect type portal, so if you've seen in your SaaS where there's like a click, go to billing, and then it goes to this external site that looks kind of like Stripe, we have Laravel Spark for that, both for the user and business management side of the billing. It is also another paid solution. Third up is Pint. Pint is the linter of Laravel. It is a wrapper of another tool, but it's just so convenient to have like an official standard solution. I know other ecosystems have this, but always worth a mention. If you combine this with some automated refactoring, code quality enforcement tools, Bob's your uncle. Like, you never have to argue about code standards again. Now, application monitoring is also a big one. This is another one of those things where you might pay for a big SaaS for this, like a Sentry or a New Relic for your APM and all that stuff. In Laravel, we have things for this. Telescope can monitor many framework internals, so like watching mails that go out, jobs, track exceptions, all sorts of like actual inner workings of your application. It's mostly intended for local development, but you can use it in prod. Pulse is one of the new kids on the block. Is a beautiful, it is a really nice looking UI. Application performance monitoring dashboard with a whole lot of extra functionality. You can view your server stats right there in that UI. And then Horizon is an interesting one. If you use Redis-based queues for your queue system, then Horizon will provide a nice management dashboard or monitoring dashboard for that. Now, we've got a few more extra things here. In terms of real-time functionality, Echo will handle your WebSocket type stuff on the front end, whereas Reverb is kind of the server-side solution for that. So if you combine these, you basically don't need any extra library that's a third-party thing like a pusher or something like that. If you want full-text search, Laravel Scout will make integration with search providers like Meilisearch or was it TypeSense. Super easy. And then just to touch a little bit on the testing side of things, PHP Unit is the gold standard in PHP apps. Some of you might know that from your old PHP days. But nowadays we have something called PEST, which is a jest-inspired syntax for PHP testing. It also provides a lot of extra helpers onto it. So yeah, very convenient. And there's much, much more that we don't have time for. Next up, let's talk about the development experience. Now, by developer experience, I mean learning Laravel, the newbie experience, and things like infrastructure. How do you actually get a Laravel app to production? So no matter what you're trying to do, there's likely at least some documentation package or tool that can help you, and plenty of community spaces to ask for help. There's official Discords, either for Laravel or some of the tools like Filament, Side, groups, forums. On ZA Tech, as many of you might be members, we have a Laravel channel there. I'm basically 3 of the 5 posters there these days. So yeah. I also want to talk a bit about this quote. I saw it basically 10 minutes before I joined this call, and I'm like, I have to add this in. It was a quote by Aaron Francis on some podcast he was on, and he was talking about the bulk of the Laravel community is people that want to see other people win. And the part I highlighted of James' post there is Laravel wants you to succeed and it wants you to be happy. And that's something I enjoy about the community, and it's kind of another reason I'm doing this talk in the first place. I want to share that chaos, the good vibes. We're all in this together, basically. Let's build some cool stuff. First up, learning Laravel. Now, we start with docs. Laravel keeps the docs up to date with exactly whatever's in the latest release. Ideally, I shouldn't have to mention that. Docs are there. They're just a thing, right? But I'm sure you've seen a ton of projects that just have terrible, awful, no good documentation. Now, at the forefront of learning resources, Laravel has its own bootcamp to teach building a very simple Laravel application with 3 different front-end stacks. And even teaches you how to do it with Vue and React as one of the options. For comprehensive, community-driven streams and casts and those sorts of things, I can recommend Laracasts and Laravel Daily as great options. Laracast, in particular, has also started doing some free courses on YouTube as an introduction to Laravel, so that's definitely worth checking out. Now, to learn in the best manner, you need to actually write your code and run it. Again, for those who've dabbled in PHP in the past, I'm sure you could remember a time in your career where setting up projects from scratch with all the programs and dependencies and dev tools and Node and NPM, database and all that felt absolutely daunting. Luckily, ecosystems like Laravel have gone to great lengths to make setting up a dev environment ridiculously easy. Do you like Docker containers? We have Laravel Sail as a developer environment-oriented option, which is not just running your web app, but it'll do your database, it can do the search, it can do the mail server, all sorts of sub-apps. If you prefer virtual machines instead, Laravel Homestead is an older solution focused on vagrant virtual machines to do this with. If you like running stuff on your host machine directly, you can use Valet, which will handle your web server config with Nginx, insert local domains on your local machine with DNS mask, and manage your PHP FPM itself as well. And for our old school WAMP, ZAMP, MAMP, whatever enthusiasts, Herd is the newest kid on the block here, which provides basically the same features as Valet, but all sorts of extra features on top. You can run your database with it. You can do all the stuff you would with all those tools I just mentioned. And it especially has a focus on Windows nowadays. There's a Windows version, and honestly, I think Herd alone makes Windows-based PHP development viable. Before this point, I wouldn't have agreed that it's doable. And especially without WSL. So you don't have any sort of Linux running on your Windows machine if you're running Herd for Laravel. Cool. So that sums up our dev environment options. Obviously, you can still run your own.
Just quickly to jump in there. So WSL is you're referring to the Linux subsystem, right?
Yeah, Windows subsystem for Linux. So the little mini Linux inside your Windows.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, fair enough. And yeah, obviously you can still write your own Docker containers. You can run your own VMs, whatever you like. It's just these are options available to you immediately to hit the ground running with. So that sums up how to get running on your local. How do you get this running on prod though? How do you set up your infrastructure safely so it won't fall over and bankrupt you with Vercel bills? As I know that's been a trend lately, apparently. So we have some official options here. If you don't want to touch a server again, Laravel supports both traditional server provisioning as a sort of platform as a service offering, like your Heroku type of thing, or even serverless. Forge is the official solution for server provisioning. It is a paid product, very useful, very neat. It offers all your server provisioning for not just your web server, but again, your database, Redis, mail servers, any sort of extra application supporting server you'd like to run. If you want a bit of a better CI/CD process, for example, zero downtime deployment, then Envoyer integrates very well with Forge or can be run on its own, basically to handle your deployments for you. Forge can do this by itself, but if you do it with Envoyer as well, it'll do it a bit better. Or if you want to go completely serverless, Laravel Vapor manages your deployments for AWS Lambda. And so you even have serverless options in PHP. How many of you knew that was a thing? And that, I think, is a good overview of the developer experience here. There were some other things I wanted to talk about, but I think it would take a bit too long. And I especially don't want to start any package manager wars by any chance. So next up, let's talk about the good stuff. Front ends with Laravel. I mean, how can I show up to FEDSA of all places without talking about front ends? Like, what?
You'd be surprised.
Well, obviously, we can't build a good app without having something for the users to look at. So I'll be speaking more about JS framework, JavaScript framework integrations, as I've kind of covered mobile already with the use of Sanctum for APIs. As a baseline for front-end stuff, Laravel ships with Vite. Is it Vite? Is it Vite? I'm not sure how you pronounce it.
Vite. Evan Yu has a thing for like things that are hard to pronounce. There's probably still some people out there that talk about Vue.js.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, Laravel ships with Vite and Tailwind out of the box for styling your web pages. It has its own templating language called Blade, which is not dissimilar to the templating you'd see in like Svelte or Vue. I wouldn't say it's similar to React style templating. It's more like the Vue side.
Yeah, I'd imagine it's more like a kind of a handlebars type thing.
I was about to say handlebars, yeah.
Is it? Have you ever, like, one thing I do remember from my PHP days is Twig. Is Twig still around?
Twig is around more for other Symfony-based frameworks. For example, there's a CMS I used to use. That was actually my very first developer talk I did as a junior, talking about Grav CMS. It was a flat file-based CMS, and it used Twig as its templating language.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Is it somewhat similar to Twig or not really?
It is similar. I mean, I'm biased. I prefer Blade syntax. I find it a bit easier to read, but I think Twig is a bit closer to handlebars in terms of feel. So yeah, we do have our own templating. I'm not going to talk about that too much because I feel like, especially for the FEDSA audience, we're more likely to focus on SPAs and views and reacts and all those sorts of things. So first up, I want to talk about SPAs and PWAs, single-page applications and progressive web apps. So as I mentioned before, Sanctum is the go-to solution for authenticating your SPA frontend against the Laravel-based API. Should work with any JS framework. It's just a token auth. But obviously the most well-tested solutions are going to be with React and Next and Vue and Nuxt and that sort of thing. And also, as mentioned, it has very specific functionality, especially for authenticating SPAs. So it's a little bit easier to just get that going. And also worth mentioning at this point is when we talk about having your SPA here, I don't mean just having your separate repo. You can have a separate repo with all your React code running as its own thing, or you can build it in your Laravel app monolithically. It'll get compiled, it'll run exactly the same way as it did before. But if your devs don't want to look at any PHP files in their repo, you can keep it separate, it'll work mostly the same. And that's pretty standard. I mean, that's a good enough solution for most. It's the way we've been doing things with other backends for a long time. But there's an interesting new option on the block specifically for this called inertia. It's taken away the need to have this API at all. It acts as a sort of glue between your backend and front end. So in your classic server-side rendering fashion, you create a controller, you get your database data with your model, and you render views. With inertia, your views are your JS page components written in React or Svelte or Vue or whatever else if you write your own integration. And it can make server-side requests without triggering full-page reloads on things like form submissions. And it can even handle its own navigation here. So you still get an SPA-like experience while still writing old-school controllers instead of an API. So this streamlines a lot of the backend functionality, especially if you prefer not having to write an API for this sort of thing. To touch on PWAs for a second, there's not too much to say other than there's nothing stopping you from doing it. There's no extra features really needed for it. Whatever you were doing to write your PWA manifest and service workers and all that, you can do exactly the same with your Laravel app and your SPA frontend. And there's one more front-end option I'd like to talk about. What if you didn't have to touch JavaScript at all? Is that even possible in 2024? Or are we all going to get sucked into a black hole of package.json issues? Enter Livewire. Livewire is a JavaScript library, that allows dynamic front-end UIs to be built purely with PHP. I'll explain this screenshot in a second. So Livewire hooks up your data to in your UI to a backend PHP component, letting you run all your front-end logic on your server while still providing a reactive single-page application-like experience. It was originally a community-made package, but has since been adopted officially into the Laravel ecosystem. So what you're seeing here basically is, imagine this is your HTML file. Here's a little bit of Blade syntax for you. This is what it'll look like. And we have this input here, and it's doing some weird stuff to something called search. And what that looks like on the side is here. It's just your search bar. On the component side, on your PHP side, you have your class, which is your Livewire component. We have the search attribute, which is modeled to that. This syntax might feel familiar here. And once you go to render your component, you can do a search based on any parameters or data you have, including this attribute. So whenever the input data here will change, it is modeled in real time to the attribute here. So Livewire will handle all that request back and forth to your PHP server, and it'll give you an equivalent experience of a dynamic SPA search right here. So yeah, I'm a big fan of it. I'm a bit of a convert. not because I dislike JavaScript, but because I personally find this a better productivity boost to use one language across the stack, much the same as you would say for using something like Express with a front-end framework. It also pairs well with more minimalist UI-oriented JavaScript frameworks like Alpine.js. I believe actually the creator of Alpine and Livewire is just the same guy, so that makes sense. And yeah, that's front-end on Laravel. And that's pretty much all I had to say. So thanks for listening to my short tour for Laravel ecosystem. And of course, that's just scratching the surface. But wait, there's more. For those who want to dig a little deeper, again, I recommend checking out Laracasts. They have some free introductory courses on YouTube that they keep up to date for major releases. There's one that's still being released right now, I believe, or still very fresh, based on the latest Laravel version. Or, last plug from me, check out larahunt.com. It's built by a friend of mine. It's basically intended to be a compendium of everything Laravel you could possibly want to look for. Thank you for listening.
All right. Okay. I have a ton of questions. I'm pretty sure that I'm pretty sure like there's a ton of questions from people viewing as well. Do you want to do a quick plug in terms of where can people find you? Where can they reach out to you?
Yeah, you can find me at nick.software. It is a real TLD, I promise. www.nick.software. If you'd like to chat,
that's amazing. Yeah.
The thing is, I wanted a 3-letter domain, but they're very expensive. So the trick is my TLD is longer than my actual domain. Cheap and easy.
Yeah. And you know, people are going to type nicksoftware.com. If you tell them to go visit it.
That's why I add the www at the beginning.
But it's cool. I like it.
Yeah. And then lastly, laravelcapetown.coza is where we're running our Laravel meetups as a Laravel community. That's it.
Okay, cool. All right, so I'm happy to dive into it. I have a ton of stuff. I made some notes here. And I think the first thing for me is, well, let's first go through some of the comments in the chat. So, cool, I just see Steve mentioned that it's his first event. So cool, thanks for joining us, Steve. I think I follow you on LinkedIn. I've seen you post some cool stuff on LinkedIn as well. So thanks for joining us on FEDSA. Then John took it upon himself to mention that he set up a Vagrant setup for me, like literally a decade ago, and I could talk about that a bit. Like that has scarred me for life. So some other things. Mandia mentioned that like it's really nice not having to kind of juggle all the kind of chatter between the browser and the backend. But guys, if you have any questions or comments, like please add some more here. And until there's anything else there, I'll just fire away with the million questions that I have. So I think let it be known that I don't, despite what John and others might think, I actually don't mind PHP that much. If you were to talk, like I haven't used it in a decade. And it's pretty clear, obviously, if I just take where JavaScript was a decade ago compared to where it is now, you'd probably see a lot of the same stuff. So it's not a fair comparison. But I do think one thing for me is I'm not a big fan of kind of heavy class-based approaches to programming. I'm definitely much more of a fan of, like functional programming, but obviously, like chances are most teams aren't fully doing a functional programming approach end to end. So generally things like data-oriented programming, those type of things, kind of like very like closure-inspired stuff. I really don't like working with classes. How how integral are classes to PHP and Laravel in 2024? Is it just something you need to kind of just be like, this is just like, if I want to write PHP, if I want to write Laravel, I need to work with classes. There's no way around it, and inheritance and all that stuff.
Yeah, so there's many ways to skin a cat. Laravel has leaned more into the OOP side, but at the same time, I think functional style code has sort of started to creep in along as we go along. So again, more ecosystem things to talk about. For example, there is a Livewire sub-package called Vault, which lets you write your Livewire components instead of a class, as you saw there, completely via a functional API. So much similar to a React component, you could write your UI and your functional logic right in the same file there.
Nice.
So things like that exist. I believe Filament takes a bit more of a functional approach to a lot of how it runs. Overall, you will still be doing OOP, but you do get some functional sugar when you need it. I suppose, like I said, if you don't want to abuse OOP too much, there's always composition over inheritance, which seems to be a much more sane way to do things. So you can write reasonable object-oriented programs. You don't have to do dog extends cat, extends animal, to the ends of the earth sort of thing.
So that's good to hear. And like without opening too many cans of worms, like I would argue that's actual traditional OOP. This kind of weird ass like Java C# thing we have, like I would actually, oh geez, I'm just digging holes for myself. But to me, that's an aberration of kind of like, like if you look at the Gang of Four stuff, like it's very clear that it's composition over inheritance. Yet, like a lot of people just conflate inheritance and OOP as kind of the same thing. But so that's curious. Like, and I'm not necessarily saying that PHP should go out of its way to allow me to write functional code. It's also the type of things you're writing is fundamentally different. So like functional pipelines might not make that much sense, whereas in something like a UI, when you have all this asynchronous stuff happening, then like having these pipelines might make more sense than trying to infer what is the state of this thing this minute and that minute. And
it's interesting you mentioned pipelines. Actually, pipelines I believe was actually a feature added to Laravel 10 last year, where you can write it exactly. You set a pipeline and you set it. You set your piece of data and it'll go through a bunch of classes, but it'll go through them in this sequential manner to exactly write that kind of code. John writes in the comments that Magento, for example, does things completely different to Laravel with classes. So I'm sure there's something a bit more functional as a framework out there. But obviously, I'm here for Laravel.
Yeah, no, but like also like that's just me being curious. I wouldn't imagine like that would be like something like that would be a pressing concern for the PHP community. We need to figure out how you can do functional programming in PHP. So another thing as well is it's interesting to kind of see, you mentioned Angular and Livewire and those things. I do think you can use Livewire with Django as well, if I'm not mistaken.
Don't know about Livewire. You might be thinking about Hotwire.
Is it Hotwire? Sorry.
Hotwire was the Rails equivalent originally.
So that's the other thing. So I wanted to ask about. So Hotwire is the DHH Rails special. Rails special. Yeah. Okay. But like I think So there's kind of a lot of movement within this space, and like with Alpine and so forth as well, which is very interesting to see. Like, would you say like that's kind of like the de facto way to do this type of thing nowadays, or are there like competing ways?
I want to say yes. I don't think the actual usage stats will bear that out on a career industry grade level. I think a lot of companies will have stuck with whatever they've originally built, but I have seen a lot of newer startups and a lot of more community involved sort of developers and projects preferring to use Livewire. More historically, Laravel has favored Vue more than anything else. I don't know. I'm not exactly entirely sure what it has been about Vue, but something with Vue always just clicked better with a Laravel developer's brain. But at the same time, with Livewire, we don't have to touch an external language and framework at all. We can stick completely with all the Laravel helpers we already have. So it's just a little bit that much nicer for Laravel developers.
Yeah, Vue has always made sense to me because Angular is kind of like it's like a batteries included, so it's very hard to glue Angular to anything. And I think React is just fundamentally so different from the way you would reason in something like Laravel. You can do it, but like it's not like it doesn't fit, like Vue is a much nicer like fit. Because you're working in the DOM that gets spit out. Whereas with React's kind of like the DOM sucks. Let's get rid of the DOM and do our own virtual DOM, which I kind of agree with. But okay, that's really cool. And so I would assume, so obviously back when I was kind of in the PHP world, and you mentioned Magento, so I did mention John and the Vagrant and stuff, and that was both of us kind of worked at a company that was using Magento 1, and there like something like doing like Ajax or fetch requests and stuff wasn't something that was built into the platform. It's something you had to kind of like almost go outside of the platform and do some tricks and whatever to load stuff onto the page after the page has rendered. I would assume with things like Livewire and those things, that's not as much a thing anymore, or is it still? Is it?
So Livewire doesn't have to touch that. It kind of the whole point of it is to obviate the need for that. So it will send the requests back and forth by itself, and it's kind of apparently, as I've learned, because I haven't been a developer as long as others, apparently we used to do this back in like 2006, where you'd send HTML over the wire directly and replace that specific part of your HTML. And Livewire and Hotwire kind of follow those paradigms. In terms of sending those Ajax requests, I know there's better like browser support for like just fetch APIs are called now, stuff like that. And I mean, Axios was in use for everything, forever, everywhere. So there's nothing that prevents that. Again, you'll define an API route, for example, in your Laravel app. You call it from your front end with whatever authentication method you need to. You get your data back. It's the same as any other backend you'd work with.
I see. John goes out of his way to kind of trigger my PTSD here. We also use prototype.js. What a nightmare. Mania has a really cool question here, which I'm also curious about. What would be the strengths of something like Livewire over like actually pulling in something like React View? So there's obviously a strong case for developer experience at DX, but like, are there any other things to consider, or are there actual cases where you would rather still opt for like Vue, or would you say Livewire is just a no-brainer?
I wouldn't say it's a no-brainer. It does take a bit of getting used to. It is a bit of its own paradigm on top of things. What I like with Livewire is, again, I don't have to touch JS if I don't need to, which helps, especially if you're fewer developers on a project. So if you don't have a front-end specialty as much, or if you're pressed for time, Livewire saves you that time, really. In terms of, I mean, on the other side of it, because you're on the PHP side, when you're handling your logic, it means you get all your Laravel goodness with all your helpers that you would have there, no extra packages you would need for that, or it also means you can use a ton of backend specific packages for your actual front-end logic, which you wouldn't otherwise be able to do as easily, or at least to do so in a way that would still act as a reactive app. So you still get a lot of the dynamism while still getting all of the things you might know about in your chosen backend tech.
Okay. What are kind of like the most like well-known like large Laravel based projects? Are there any that come to mind?
So
I actually don't know.
If you've heard of Statamic, is a CMS alternative to WordPress with very funky design by Jack McDade. That's based in Laravel. There's a few other small projects that are in the open source space. If you've heard of something called Monica PRM, it's supposed to be.
I know about like the other one. I don't know how to pronounce it. I've heard people pronounce it as systemic. Like
Statamic,
Yeah.
Statamic, I don't know.
The S1.
That one. Yeah. So that's
Yeah.
that's based on that. Monica is a smaller scale thing. It's called the Personal Relation Manager. It's like a CRM, but for your Facebook contacts type thing.
Cool.
I mean, there are a lot of shops out there using Laravel in production, again, especially in South Africa. I've worked at them, like Car and Classic, big Laravel shop. I know some places like Superbalist had some Laravel at some point. I don't know what the status of that is now. I mean, I've worked at fintechs as recent as last year that were still using Laravel in production for high throughput KYC and loan type stuff and all sorts of like very complex use cases. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And so would you often find that at a specific scale and size, people like, how likely are people to just use like the actual Laravel templating all the way through, or would that be something that you start out with initially, but then obviously as you eventually scale, it might make more sense to decouple that, or do people just continue with that all the way through?
Yeah, I mean, scale, I think, again, there's a lot of solutions to it. So you don't have to split it out if you don't need to. You can chuck another server in a load balanced fashion and just route all your front end requests to that one. And the other one will do like backend and job processing and that sort of stuff. So even though technically you've got like, a couple hundred kilobytes, a couple hundred megs of wasted PHP files on one server, you still have your same code everywhere. You still have your entire app in front of you whenever you develop. So yeah, you don't have to split it. You can. It's whatever makes sense for your team and your preference, really. In terms of starting out with one solution and working towards another, I would also say that's preference. These days, I would just start, personally at least, because a lot of projects I work on, it's either myself or like one or two developers. I'll probably just start with Livewire and especially Filament, because so the thing with Filament is it's built on Livewire, so it provides all its UI components in Livewire itself. So you can, instead, like I said, the admin panel part is built of a bunch of components, your search bars, your data tables.
Is it like a higher abstraction on top of Livewire?
Yeah, like at this point, I kind of have started saying to people, Filament is actually a bit of a meta framework on top of Livewire and Laravel, or it can be, and you can use it as such. So like I can use Livewire. I don't even have to write any of the UI components anymore. I can just call them because somebody else has built them for me.
Okay, I think this maybe also ties in somewhat like to what John mentioned is, like with Livewire, doing any type of, like you did mention PWA and that type of thing is because you're effectively, but like that's the case in any instance where you're doing a lot of server-side rendering. Whether it is with like Next.js or Rails or Django or whatever, so probably at that point, like you'd probably just like use the API, like the REST endpoint or whatever. Probably the same as well for if you're doing like mobile apps or something.
I mean, with PWAs, again, you're going to define them in the same way, even if you're using Livewire. But because Livewire is so backend focused, you're basically just going to show your offline screen to your user as soon as they run in offline mode, just like John says.
Which I guess brings me to the next question is, so obviously my reference point for PHP hosting was kind of like your traditional like shared LAMP, like hosting providers, and then but after that people started throwing stuff on like EC2 and so forth, and I think at that point I kind of moved on to other things. What is it? What do you generally do nowadays? I think you did mention like I think it was Forge. Vapor, and so forth. Are they kind of like widely used?
Yeah, I would say they are. I mean, I think a lot of, again, more industry-wide, it's probably going to be more hand-built stuff. So especially if you're using Docker or any sort of custom sort of setup to specific to your app, a lot of places are still running their own stuff. They'll run a Jenkins server, whatever CI they want, and just chuck it on. But if you want to skip all that, and especially on a smaller scale, save yourself the time of setting all that stuff up, Forge will do it. I mean, Forge will provision to basically any cloud provider because it has stuff it supports out of the box. So you hook up your like AWS account and you click like make a server and it'll make the server. Or if you're using a custom provider, you just give it the SSH logins and it'll still do it for you. So yeah, like you provision all that stuff. It handles everything for you. And yeah, like I said, you don't have to touch a server. You will when you want to debug prod, like let's be honest, but in terms of setup, yeah, you don't have to do anything yourself.
Yeah. Okay, that's really cool. And so these,
I was going to say there are also like community alternatives in the space. One of them is called Ploy, Ploi. It's very similar to Forge and Envoy and all that. I also use that quite a bit.
Okay. And so how much, like, so there's a ton of, this is one thing I don't actually know about Laravel, is kind of like all these kind of SaaS tooling around it. And how, like real talk, like how, like what is the pricing around that? Is that reasonable or is it on the more expensive side? I can say, for example, like the Vercel stuff is just, I think it's overpriced. I'll go on the record here and say that I think the Vercel stuff is too expensive. I don't use any of the Vercel stuff. I roll my own stuff. And then so the pricing, and the other thing is like kind of to what degree, how vendor locking is it? Like how easy is it to switch out to something else for your authentication or whatever after the fact?
Yeah. So in terms of the paid stuff, it's not much. It's very clearly something very useful that you'd spend a lot of dev time on that they charge you a couple of bucks for. So a lot of the projects are charged at like $99 per project. So for example, Nova, the current version is Nova 4. So you'll get unlimited upgrades for a year for Nova 4 versions, basically.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So that's $99 per project, and then they have like a bulk pricing with like $299. You can use it on unlimited projects. So they have stuff like that in place. For Forge and Envoy, that's monthly pricing. They have separate tiers for that. I think it starts at like $5 for like one project, and then it gets a bit higher quickly if you're hosting a lot of stuff for clients. But especially if that cost is distributed, it doesn't matter. They're not handling the actual cloud costs for you. You are paying for the act of provisioning and the convenience act of deploying and managing your sites and all that. And on Vapor, I believe it's $40 a month, and it'll handle that serverless stuff for you. So most of the stuff is like it's not like pay-as-you-go pricing. Like I said, you're not going to get bankrupted on Vercel builds. That's going to go like, oh, you got DDoSed. Here's a $300,000 bill. There was a second half of the question.
So it's a kind of interop, like in terms of like how easy is it? Yes.
You can swap out like all of it if you want. And at the same time, like nothing really locks you in. Like if you're using Forge, then moving to an alternative might suck a bit. I know Ploy actually has its own tool they've built specifically to migrate Forge servers across. But if you want to use a different auth provider, you can use it. There's probably a package for it to handle that logic for you. You just rip out whatever you need on the Laravel side. A lot of it is also interface based. So a lot of the time, especially if they build a Laravel specific package for, let's say, what's it called, Clerk, then they'll match those interfaces in Laravel. So in terms of your actual code, you'll still call the adapter. That's the word I was looking for. Then you'll call the exact same auth check, auth user, auth whatever functions in your actual application code. And then you handle all the Clerk specific stuff in the very small spots that you need to.
Okay, like that's really cool because so I've been obviously I've used something like Firebase, for like at several occasions. But one thing I've never liked about Firebase is like it's almost like that abstraction itself starts creeping into your own logic in all these places, and you need to start doing weird things to accommodate Firebase. And like the past 3 years, like I've been using Superbase, which is kind of like a open source alternative to. Like I really like it, but I also know some of the guys there, and like it's just like really awesome guys, and like they're building an awesome product, and I never actually realized like how important this is to me, like how important it is for me to actually be able to keep that stuff separate and not actually model my code on like against these services, or well, not against, like the other way around. Have these services model my code, and I don't know. Like I'm speaking nonsense now. I'm speaking.
I mean, I get what you mean. Like
yes.
From my perspective, from the reverse, for example, I've found it like horrifying that there's such a colossal focus, especially let's say more in JavaScript land, that like no, you can't roll your own auth. That's absurd. You must go pay this provider for this thing. Oh, you're not going to host anything yourself. Nobody can set up a VPS anymore. You're going to go to Vercel and Heroku. No, we don't need that. Like I said, a lot of these even official ecosystem things just flat out match popular software as a service providers for free.
Yeah. Oh, like it's but like obviously that's with the caveat that you actually have a server running. Like obviously, but like I do hear what you're saying, and I'd be curious to see how that changes in the next 5 years, because I do think a large part of that is because like I found kind of the front end in the JavaScript world being very like junior heavy, bottom heavy in the last couple of years, and I think now that kind of the market has shrunk a bit, like I think like it's going to start like becoming a little bit less. So obviously, a lot of tooling was kind of catered to the fact that you have a lot of people writing JavaScript, whatever, that aren't very experienced programmers and so forth. But you still have things like Passport.js and so forth. And there's a really cool one called Auth. I think it's auth.dev, which is really cool. You can completely just use kind of third-party like OAuth stuff. You don't even need to. So that's really interesting. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening there. But it's I do hear you. Like there is a lot of cool things that you get by just the fact that you are actually running a server.
For me, it's kind of the part of the opposite side for lock-in is all these services have their free tiers. Sure, restrictive as they may be or not, they can pull that rug at any time. PlanetScale just did that. They have to focus on profitability. When are the others going to do that? I'm always worried about that. So the fact that I have a package that'll do it for me, sure, they might rug pull and kill the code, but I at least have a copy. It'll run until whatever. And push comes to shove, I can upgrade it myself between language versions. And if you do go to the paid tier, what are you going to pay for each service? You're going to pay for your auth, you're going to pay for Stripe Connect on top of your billing costs or whatever. Whereas you can still run all this on a $5 server. Like scaling a VPS vertically is like surprisingly cheap compared to all these extra things you're going to pay for otherwise.
It's interesting how VPSs have kind of made a bit of a comeback. And
it's the loans aren't free anymore, so now we've got to pay for the things we used to use.
Like money isn't free anymore. So it's just like I think there was a point where like it was just like so cheap to just use a third-party thing, and the free tier was so generous that it's like it's probably not even worth setting up a VPS, even if you knew how to or you could. But it's interesting how things are changing now. I think like with these type of things, you just need to do your due diligence. Like for me, like the auth stuff, when I'm using a SaaS thing, I just ensure that it's just like the way I interface with it is some JWT thing, because like if that I don't want to use that tomorrow, whatever, I can just roll my own thing and it's all just a JWT. I'm not sending like cookies and stuff up and down. So I think if you do, but one thing I can definitely say officially that I'm concerned about is the market share of Next.js and Vercel. Obviously you mentioned in certification is a fact of life and it's coming. Like I think Vercel is pretty decent at the moment in terms of what you can do with the free tier and so forth. But it's definitely coming. Like they're going to pull a Heroku eventually. I'm a bit concerned about that.
I can't knock those services. Again, you use them if you need to, if you have the use case for it, if it makes sense and if it fits your exact use case. But again, I mean, even Vercel now admitting that Edge doesn't really work anymore. They propagandized this for how many years? How many other things have happened in the background that have just basically been propaganda for you to pay for somebody's service?
So I'm actually like
That's a bit of a tangent, but that's
no. I'm curious to. I'm like curious to unpack that a bit. Like I actually I'm not 100% sure what you're referring to. So I'm curious to.
So there was a bit of a tweet storm drama thing in the last week or so where Vercel people kind of admitted edge distribution of your app doesn't really make sense because your DB is always going to be far away. So it doesn't matter how close your app is to your user. If your DB is far, it's still going to feel slow. And everyone's like, whoa, wait a minute. You're increasing your pricing in the last few months. You're doing all sorts of weird things with DDoS prevention or not.
Yeah.
You're charging people how much. And now you're saying the thing you told us was the future for how many years isn't anymore?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah. Okay.
Like I said, the money's not free anymore, so the paradigms are changing for a lot of companies.
Yes.
And that's where I think a lot of these shifts are happening.
And the appeal of Edge was always the cost. I don't use the Vercel Edge stuff, so I don't know. Where I do use Edge is the Dino deploy. But like I think like with Dino just architecturally, like Edge makes sense because like it does a lot of like resolving of packages and caching of packages and stuff. And like there's some interesting Cloudflare like Edge stuff now as well. But like that's interesting. I haven't heard like about that. But to me, like the appeal of Edge has always just been how cheap it is. So if that's no longer the case, then it kind of loses a bit of its appeal. But like also talking about Edge, like I'm curious whether this is a good segue to SQLite and libsql. Tersa and those type of things. Because I know you've been kind of mentioning a bit about kind of your own exploration into those type of things. So I'm curious whether there's a tie-in here with Laravel, and whether you've attempted to use SQLite with Laravel.
Yeah. So you're referring to a thread I posted this week, last week.
Sorry, your audio is. I don't know if it's on my
side
or.
It is, it's the one that works, so I'm not sure.
Play some other one. Oh, there you go.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know what that was.
Yeah. So as I was saying, basically in the thread I posted on socials, the winds of opinion on SQLite have changed recently. It was kind of DHH's post, the Rails guy, about, he was basically like, servers are better and cheaper and SSDs are faster than ever. So the speed concerns of SQLite are not as much of a problem anymore. And then if you look at more on the small scale or indie hacker type of side, Peter Levels, infamous as he is, runs his stuff on like a handful of PHP files, jQuery and SQLite for quite a few users. Like he's not running at small scale for his stuff. And it just goes to show that like your tech doesn't matter as much as you think for making money. Which is what we need to do now. Like again, the money wells have run dry in VC. You need to make a profit, so it doesn't matter what you're doing, as much as we'd like to think. It's about using what's performant for you, what's useful for you. So a lot of makers now have started doing more SQLite stuff. Laravel adopted it as the default setting. It's traditionally been more of a MySQL thing. Again, there's nothing blocking you from using it. It's just like the default driver has been set to SQLite instead of where it used to be MySQL. Nothing else has changed.
Really? In Laravel?
They followed. So Rails did it first, I think last year or early this year, and then Laravel followed suit with Laravel 11, I believe.
Yeah, I know DHH made a big deal of it. Yeah, but like he also does some other stuff. Like I think they kind of host like all their stuff themselves, and so. I find the stuff to be a bit hit or miss.
Exactly. But if you also think about his products with Once and Campfire, which are like self-hosted things, it makes sense for a lot of things like that. It vastly simplifies the moving parts of your software to not have a separate database server and just have a SQLite file. And I think much in the same as a VPS scaled vertically gets a lot further than most people think. A SQLite file or a handful of SQLite files, which was a pattern I spoke about in that thread, actually can get you quite a ways away. It's kind of the thing of the meme a few years ago was, why are you running an entire Kubernetes cluster when you got like 10 users? Now it's, do you need to run a whole MySQL server even when you've got 5 users?
Yeah, the Kubernetes thing is interesting, and like, it's the same. You find the same with people like spinning up Next.js and whatever for their own personal blogs and whatever. I think the thing there is that we often forget is like people want to upskill in their career. So you're always tempted to over-engineer things because like you want to get experience with this thing. Yeah, like, but that's a completely different discussion. But yeah, no, I hear you. So another question that I have is, wait, like, let me just go through my list to make sure I cover everything. So with the like static typing, so obviously this wasn't really that much of a thing when I kind of was in the PHP world. Is it optional at this point?
Yeah, all of it's completely optional. So PHP puts a lot of focus on backwards compatibility. So especially when you consider big projects like WordPress, there's a lot of projects out there, they can't change a lot of their code drastically between versions because there's a lot of different moving parts that they might break, and like you can't have a smooth self-updater, for example, to do all that. But yeah, it's completely optional. My personal preference, and what I've seen some places do, is just have it automatically enforced. So, for example, my Pint setup, the linter, has a setting where on every single file it sees, especially new files, it will add, there's a line called declare strict typing, basically. And if that line is present in the file, it is a per file setting. I'll add that, which is maybe not as great. It's not a like runtime wide thing. It's per file is the typing handled strictly. So I have a linting rule that for every single file in my app, all of them will always have strict types declared and enforced.
Okay. And in terms of package management, like does Laravel have its own like package manager, or does it use a PHP package manager?
So the gold standard in PHP is Composer. It's Pickle for like PHP extensions, and then Composer for everything uses Composer really, with its auto loading patterns and such. Yeah, the developer experience of Composer is pretty good as far as I've seen, or as we've discussed in the past, I think at least better than Python. That always felt like a pain of an environment to get up. You got a requirements.txt, and you got virtual environments. Composer install, man. That's it.
So how does that? So JavaScript solved this problem of like optional. So it's interesting. There's been a lot of developments in the JavaScript world around that. So there's this new thing, JSR, that is being created by the Dino team. So Ryan Dahl and them, which is kind of like a type, like almost like a type focused package like repository, because like one of the things is obviously with standard npm is like things started getting a bit weird if you have things that are typed and you have things that are not typed, and so the way that JavaScript has solved this, or TypeScript, is by having @types packages that you install separately for things that are not typed. How does kind of what's the situation with like third-party typing and so forth in Laravel and PHP?
Yeah. So because it's a per file setting, you don't have to care about it. As long as the package does what you need to, whatever. So obviously, if you trust the code quality of strict typing more, then you might want to dig through your GitHub repo of whatever packages you have to make sure they're strictly typed. But yeah, like on the whole, you don't need to care. You don't need to install any extra packages for it. As long as they match your PHP language version that you're running, and if whatever other dependency versions. So for example, especially Laravel packages will support a few versions of Laravel. So as long as they support whatever you're using, you don't have to care. It's right there as you need it.
Yeah, cool. So, okay, I think maybe like we're kind of almost hitting the 1.5-hour mark here, so we should probably start thinking about closing off. And I think a nice place maybe to start towards ending things off for me would be kind of talking about kind of trade-offs. So are there? So I want to ask you like kind of what do you consider as good projects for Laravel? What do you consider as projects that are not that great for Laravel? But before we dive into that, like just personally, have you encountered any projects or any type of work where you're like, okay, Laravel is probably not the best solution for this thing, or are you just like Laravel all the time, always just number one Laravel?
Yeah. So, yeah, again, I've done most of my career in Laravel, which also means I've done certain kinds of projects far more than others. So I can't say I've seen too much that shouldn't have been done with Laravel. I suppose when you're talking about like super high throughput, super high CPU, GPU usage type services, like a web streaming type thing, I probably wouldn't write that in any PHP, let alone Laravel. But what I would do is for the general UI, the general application itself, I would build that in Laravel and then incorporate the specific pieces in another language. Like there's a lot of synergy with Golang, actually. There's quite a few developers from the PHP side who've transitioned to Golang and built into operating systems. There's a very notable one called Franken PHP, which is actually basically PHP compiled with Caddy, the web server, into like one PHP runtime that's actually Go-based. So there's all sorts of weird things like that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like anecdotally, it feels to me like Go has been gaining a lot of market share the last 2 years.
Yeah.
I don't know what's going on there, but like there's just so many stuff that I'm seeing like written in Go now that like I also think it's maybe some of it is just like, you know, like as we said, like the zero interest rates and whatever. Like I think performance is now every extra cent you can squeeze out of your services.
So obviously the trade-off then on performance is, for example, Go doesn't have a framework similar to Laravel. There's a few projects trying to emulate it, but from what I've seen, it seems to be more at a community level. A lot of the community doesn't want to have a big batteries included framework thing. So there'll be a HTTP package and a data model and all these things. So it's not there yet on that side. So you use your Laravel for your main web app, and then you use Go for when you really need performance.
Yes, yeah. So it's like in one of the other trade-offs as well, it has a very simple typing system, which, you know, like for me can sometimes be a bit of a pain. But I think that's also part of the trade-offs in terms of because Go, yes, man, Go is like Go goes. Like yes, it's fast, man. But again,
that focus is sort of on a lower level of application performance and a certain level of code and like handling certain kinds of problems. Whereas your Laravel
developer experience,
the developer experience and things are oriented more on the upper level, building your SaaS, building your service and your business, and that sort of thing. So using each appropriately, there's nothing stopping you from using both.
Yeah, it's interesting. So what you're effectively saying is you're kind of using like more like, so in the way you would have like an API and something like React or whatever, you kind of have somewhat of a similar relationship with Laravel handling like your templating and your kind of user facing stuff. And then you might have like some microservices for, like, let's say you're doing stuff like image transformations or whatever. Like I wouldn't write that in PHP. I wouldn't write that in Node or JavaScript. Probably like Rust or something. So okay, that's interesting. I haven't considered.
I think one interesting thing to note, it was in that and much more section, something called Laravel Octane. It's basically an alternative way of running your PHP app. It runs similarly to Node, where there's like a long running process. It keeps your app in memory. It's very quick. It's very fast compared to FPM. It's also a completely different way of running PHP, which usually was a very request by request based type of thing. And Octane supports multiple different runners for PHP. And again, a few of these are Go-based. So Franken PHP is one of them, Golang-based. Roadrunner is another, which is also Go-based. And it's interesting to see that this kind of interop is happening at a core level of actually running your language entirely, let alone like high throughput image processing. Like we're running PHP itself on Go. Like I find that super interesting, and it gives us quite a bit of a speed advantage, while again maintaining the high level build my stuff. It runs super fast. I don't have to care about the low level performance anymore. It's just done.
Yeah, and like things are even probably going to get even weirder. Like, like so with the WebAssembly stuff, like so that example where you can run an actual WordPress server now in your browser. I think things are just going to get even weirder going forward in terms of.
There's one more thing to mention there for you. Then is it's still in alpha. It's been in alpha for quite a while. Something called native PHP.
Oh yeah.
Which is about running PHP on the desktop without effectively running a web server on your desktop.
Interesting. So is that akin to something like Electron or whatever? Is it like just in a wrapper?
Yeah. So I believe it's normally paired with Electron or Tauri for the actual interface side. If you were using like Vue for that, and then it'll run the actual like your backend logic, as it were, in PHP in a process. It's very experimental. Wouldn't recommend it. But I mean, if we can have Swift on servers, why can't we have PHP on desktop?
Yeah, no, like, but it's interesting. Like, it's like I find this stuff fascinating. Yeah, cool. But thanks so much. Like, I don't know if there's anything you wanna mention before we end off, or.
I mean, the other side was community stuff. I know you mentioned you were keen to hear a bit more.
Yes. So let's we have about 5 minutes, and then we have the hour and a half. So so let me maybe quickly formalize that question. So I'd be curious why there was a shift from kind of the broader PHP to Laravel specifically. I guess some of that is just personal preference, like because of the tool set you're using, and obviously, like I'm the same, like there's a reason why we do front-end development South Africa, because a lot of the stuff is like stuff that I think about and do and whatever. So it's good, like it's stuff I enjoy. But like I'm curious, like what the thinking was behind that, and what I'm also curious about is like it's almost like Laravel's almost like kind of like almost a language on its own. It's no longer just like it's kind of like almost a force by itself and not just an option in PHP, which I think like also there's another crazy experimental question there about like like what is there a future for Laravel that like is not PHP bound? But
that's a whole kettle of fish. I have no idea on that question. But to talk specifically about Laravel Cape Town, so I ran PHP Cape Town for a little while. I had like one in-person meetup before lockdowns hit. So we ran that online for a few years. Because everything was online, I spoke to PHP Joburg and we merged that into PHP South Africa. That ran for a little while. I personally got burnt out with it. Not that in particular. I was doing a lot of other things, and I was at a point in my career where I was hitting burnout. So I cut back. I left PHP South Africa. Unfortunately, at the time, my co-organizers also were quite swamped and dealing with their own time things. So nothing really happened with PHP South Africa as a whole for another year or so. And so last year I picked it up again. They reached out. They were like, listen, somebody's take this over. And I'm like, cool, I'll do it again. So I did that for a while. We did a few meetups again. And I'm like, yeah, this is cool. But like, it doesn't align fully with what I'm doing. It's like, obviously I have a personal preference for Laravel, but I'm trying to, everything I do should align in some way with what I'm doing with my work, what I'm doing with my life, what I prefer doing. And as much as I love my fellow PHP devs, like I'm a Laravel guy. I'd like to explore the depths we have in that ecosystem. Like I said, it's almost a language on its own at this point. And also in terms of scoping locally, I came to a point where it was like the scope of PHP South Africa felt too broad. Because it means I have to cater for the developers in Durban, in Joburg, in any other part of the country, and then developers of their own frameworks in Symfony, in Magento, whatever they're doing. And like, I can support them, but I'm not the best person to do that. And especially when you have things like WordPress, which are even way bigger than Laravel, and also have their own dominance and effectively their own language. They have their own meetups. So why can't we? And then lastly, in person, locally, I'm in or near Cape Town, and I've missed in-person meetups for quite a bit. I still do online ones. I mean, I'm here obviously, but like I'm keen to actually see who these members of the community locally are. Like I know there's a ton of us out there, but none of us gather really, like especially on the Laravel side. I know shops here and there. I'm like, I'll glue you all together. Let's do it.
That's really
And
cool.
that's largely my reasoning for it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like it's like I kind of see. Interestingly enough, the front end stuff, we've never really had that problem where it's just like it just diverges so much that it's like we can't even speak. But like it's interesting. Like we haven't found that. But what I do find it is with the design stuff that Justin and Liesel and I are involved in is like design as a field has just diverged so much that like there are people doing design, like when you get into like service design and, like all of the, like people that like, so someone did a talk on like, designing like medical facilities and stuff. And, like at some point it's like, I just make the icons and the buttons and make the hover effects. Like there's no real overlap here that we can have a meaningful conversation. And I can imagine like that being the case as well. Like you very much might have like someone from WordPress and who's like a solid WordPress developer, and there's very limited overlap actually in terms of meaningfully talking about things. It's interesting. Like I kind of get that. Yeah. All right. Okay. But yeah, so just maybe as a quick segue, you mentioned in-person stuff. So I forgot to mention, I should have mentioned this at the start, but we are actually, Frontend Development South Africa, we're actually doing an in-person event on Saturday in Cape Town. So if anyone is keen to check that out, just check out on meetup.com, Frontend Development South Africa, or LinkedIn or whatever. I'm actually hosting a workshop on forms and form design and foot guns when it comes to designing forms and stuff. So should have probably advertised that at the start, but luckily you reminded me about in-person stuff. But yeah, cool. Thanks so much, Nick. This is really great. I really enjoyed this. It's been super enlightening for me because of my own ignorance around PHP and so forth. And John has been trying to get me to give PHP another chance. Yeah, we'll have to have him come do a talk. But like this is maybe a good first step.
Oh, awesome! Thanks for having me. I'm glad it was of value. I wasn't sure like what could I speak about to front-end oriented developers that like would be interesting enough from this perspective. But in terms of maybe a last thing to try and convert you, all I'm going to say is Google PHP Lambos. Does JS have Lambos? I leave that up to the viewer. You're gonna have to Google it.
Okay, all right. Well, let's see. But maybe I'll join you at the next meetup.
Oh, sure. We're having our next meetup as well. The worldwide meetup, watch party. There's a Laravel worldwide meetup. We do watch parties every month. That'll be in Belleville on Tuesday evening, and then we'll do our next proper Laravel Cape Town in June.
Cool, awesome. We're in Belleville. I'm based in Belleville, so
I gotta go check the address for that. I don't know off the top of my
head. But I might legit pop in.
We're hosting it. We host the watch parties at members' houses usually, just as a more intimate sort of thing. Yeah.
Cool. Probably Jonathan's house.
It is Jonathan's house.
Is it? I've been there, so I know. Cool. I'll bring my.
I didn't want to dox him.
I'll bring my swimming trunks. Okay, cool. But thanks so much, Nick. Like this was really great. All right, and then thanks everyone for joining. Have a great evening. Cool. Cheers.
Cheers.